Hey everybody, it's Erik, co-founder, partner of Village Global, a network-driven venture firm. And this is Venture Stories, a podcast covering topics relating to tech and business with world-leading experts. Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of Village Global's Venture Stories. I'm here today joined by a special returning guest, Daniel Pianko, and his co-founder at Achieve Partners, Ryan Craig. Ryan, Daniel, welcome to the podcast.
Good to be here. Thanks for having us.
Excited.
So by way of introduction, why don't you introduce what is Achieve Partners and some of the backstory behind it and the evolution of it?
Sure. So Daniel and I have been working together now for 17 years. And so we started when I was at Warburg Pincus, helping to build their education and training investing activity. And Daniel was at Stanford and came and worked off the side of my desk for a summer and happened to write the first draft of an investment memorandum that became Warburg's most successful education investment called Bridgepoint Education, which was one of the fastest growing online universities in the U.S., went from 0 to 80,000 students in 5 years and went public. And so it was on the back of that we were able to raise our first fund together, University Ventures, in 2011. And our new firm is Achieve Partners for reasons that will become clear. University Ventures didn't really accurately describe our strategy. So we needed a new name, and Achieve is that name.
And please get into what is the strategy? What's upcoming?
Sure. So we've written about hundreds of articles on the challenges that we have in higher education and what we call the crisis of completion in higher education, the crisis of affordability. And increasingly, the crisis of employability. A lot of it is driven by the fact that we, in the sort of early in the last decade, looking at the statistics of millennials coming out of the Great Recession and seeing that how much they were underperforming prior generations on virtually every economic metric in terms of income, wealth, home ownership, new business creation. Millennials were really not launching in the same way that our generation had launched. And obviously the student loan debt that they were accumulating was a big part of that, about $40,000 on average per student who takes on debt, which is everyone who can't pay out of pocket, which is the vast majority of students given the cost of college. But the flip side of the affordability crisis is the crisis of employability, right? Because if every graduate came out into a $60,000 a year job, they'd be able to easily afford $40,000 of student loan debt. But we know that about half of all students who graduate, and of course only about half of students who start graduate, but the half who do graduate, of those who graduate, 50% are underemployed in their first job. So if you're underemployed in your first job, pretty much half the time you're going to be underemployed 5 years later, and a significant portion still a decade. That's the problem that we were looking down the barrel of at University Ventures, and we began investing in new pathways to jobs. We began investing in, for example, coding boot camps, and we coined this term last mile training to reflect where we think the gap is between what our existing post-secondary education system does and what employers are seeking. And the real gap is not that somehow colleges have gone backwards. It's just that they haven't come close to keeping up with the world of work and what employers are looking for. And what they're looking for increasingly are specific combinations of digital technical skills and business knowledge. And colleges and universities just simply don't train on either the digital skills or the business skills employers are seeking. So, for example, I was speaking 2 years ago to an audience of college and university presidents, and I asked them, about 200 of them in the room, I said, can you raise your hand if your school provides any training at all on the Salesforce platform? And not one hand went up. And that's a problem when there are 300,000 open Salesforce jobs and 5 million will be created over the next 5 years. And it's a problem when virtually all sales jobs in the US now ask for some experience with a Salesforce or CRM platform. So that pathway that, how many successful business leaders started their career working in sales, right out of college for a large corporation. When those job descriptions ask for 2 years of Salesforce experience, that pathway is closed off to hundreds of thousands of young Americans. So that's the issue we were trying to tackle. And we began investing, as I said, in boot camp models and other models that maybe don't charge tuition but take income share agreements, which I think you talked with Daniel about previously. We began kind of conceptualizing the skills gap in terms of frictions, right? Why don't tens of millions of people go out and get these digital skills and business skills that employers are seeking? Two reasons primarily. One is the cost of upskilling. And the second, and even more important one, is the uncertainty of the employment outcome, right? If you could wave a magic wand and say, you're not taking any financial risk and we're going to guarantee you a job, you'd have millions of people going out and getting these digital skills and business skills that employers are looking for. But on the other side, you still have what we call hiring friction, which is the reduced propensity of employers to want to hire candidates for these entry-level roles when they literally haven't done that job before, which turns the idea of an entry-level job into an oxymoron. But that's the experience that millions of young people have had. Jobs that should be entry-level, could have been entry-level, maybe once were entry-level, now are asking for years of experience or educational credentials that are just simply unrealistic. We call that credential inflation. So that's the challenge that we're seeing. And hiring friction is manifested by employers who just want that perfect candidate ready to be productive on day one. Most American employers have sort of disinvested in entry-level training, and there's a free rider problem obviously associated with it. If I invest in training my entry-level employees, because 50% of college grads who enter these jobs churn out of the jobs within 2 years, who's going to benefit? Probably my competitor will free ride off my investment in entry-level training. So with a number of prominent exceptions at the very sort of high end of the economy, the vast majority of American employers have exited entry-level training. They want the perfect candidate served up on a silver platter. If they don't find that candidate, they won't hire them. So, Daniel and I, about 5 years ago, began looking for new models, new pathways to employment that would reduce or eliminate both those frictions, the friction for the individual, the education friction, and the friction for the employer, the hiring friction. And we hit upon staffing and business services with the view that the hardest part of this problem to solve is that end connection to the employer. And that's a connection that's very difficult for a school or education-oriented enterprise to bridge, simply because employers just don't have the time of day to engage with hundreds of different schools, right? They just won't. And to the extent they do, on-campus recruiting is fairly superficial, done as an interface between human resources and career services at the institutions. And there's no relationship really whatsoever to the actual hiring managers, the managers who have the need for the talent. In contrast to that, business services companies that are already delivering a valued service in a skill gap area across technology or healthcare, where the largest gaps are, they do have those relationships. And so you can leverage that distribution to push a new product, which is last mile training, effectively, which is developing purpose-trained entry-level talent and making it available to clients on a try before you buy basis to eliminate that hiring friction. And so we've now done that 5 or 6 times across our portfolios, and we've seen that it can dramatically accelerate growth and really create what we call talent as a service businesses, and dramatically expand revenue growth and expand margins as well. So that's what Achieve is doing. And obviously, when we're buying $100 million IT staffing companies, or we're buying $80 million healthcare IT solutions businesses, that's neither university nor ventures. So that's a long way of explaining why we have a new firm and a new name.
Thanks for that. That's fascinating. why this may be obvious to you guys, but why don't and maybe you touched on it a little bit, but why isn't there like Walmart University or Facebook University or Google University? They're looking for recruiting proprietary recruiting pipelines, and people are looking for jobs. Or why isn't there sort of a white label solution that goes to these people and says that they'll create custom boot camps for them, so they don't have to all they need to do is lend their brand and use them as a proprietary source. Is that a good business idea, or how do you think about that?
Well, I think put yourself in the shoes of the of Walmart or any large employer. For the most part, they're happier to leave jobs unfilled than they are to take a necessary hiring risk. And we really see that across the economy. To ask them, in addition to filling jobs, to invest in some elaborate training program, that's asking even more. You're asking them to make an even bigger investment than to invest in sort of unproven talent. So, I think it's this sort of the late capitalist model, which is sort of shorter term thinking. What are and the reality is nobody gets fired for not filling a position. You get fired for hiring the wrong person for that position. So most of the initiatives we see in large corporates are around taking employees, often sort of frontline employees, and trying to figure out upskilling pathways within the organization for them, and that's critical. We absolutely need to see that. But that's not solving the problem. There are 7 million unfilled jobs in America right now. And most of those jobs are sort of high skill positions requiring these digital skills and business skills that we're seeing. And they're not going to be filled by sort of corporate upskilling initiatives. There need to be pathways from outside the enterprise into those entry-level positions within the enterprise, and employers are not going to do it themselves. But who will build those pathways is companies that can build a business around providing that talent to their clients, and that's where we're focused.
I think there are two kind of very different questions though embedded in what you're saying, though, Erik. One is, should Google be a university as well, right? And so I think Google did launch the certificate program, and I think it's taking, they're transforming. I think it's, can these businesses that have ecosystems and platforms transform what they do, where training is a cost center, to where training or selling the certification on their platform becomes a revenue center. And, Cisco did an amazing job of this, creating this, Cisco University, and for years was kind of the gold standard. But modern tech companies have sort of abandoned the ecosystem development to effectively nobody. And that's kind of why you have 300,000 unfilled jobs for Salesforce alone. You think about Google, AdWords, tax, and all that. So one big bucket is, can big tech companies and even healthcare companies and others like HCA just bought a nursing program, can they create a revenue center out of training on their platforms? And I think that's an amazing direction for these tech companies to go. But the other thing, most companies aren't Google. Google doesn't have a hiring problem. Google doesn't have a problem finding applicants. Everybody sends a resume to Google. Everybody knows Google, right? It's like USAA or Geico. I mean, who wants to wake up on Saturday morning and go join an insurance company? How many people say, I want to have a stunning career in healthcare IT? Effectively nobody. And so what the result is, who's trained, how, there are 100,000 unfilled positions on electronic medical records. And part of that is because no one actually says, hey, I want to be an EMR tech, right? But the job pays $150,000 a year. So if you say to a biology major, hey, you have a choice, we'll train you, we'll get you certified, and we'll get, you'll make $150,000 in 3 years out of college. That's an amazing win. Now, the real question is, Walmart won't do that because they don't view that provision of talent as a revenue source. Because if they train somebody on one of their systems, they can just walk down the street. And so what I think the modern apprenticeship is going to be what we're doing here, which is creating these apprenticeships driven by specific platform needs, and then being able to effectively monetize by going to multiple employers who have trouble attracting talent, not the Googles, into their ecosystem. So I think you're hitting on two very different points, right? I do think that Google will be one of the great educational institutions of the 21st century. I just don't think they figured it out yet.
What would it look like for them to figure it out? You think, like what form factor or what could you envision when they do figure it out, or when someone like that figures it out?
Well, I think these great brands, and actually we have an amazing company in our portfolio called Yellowbrick, which actually partners with brands. People trust brands more than they trust universities in a lot of respects. Like if you're going to getting the Google internship is far more valuable than having a Harvard degree for many people. And so I think that to some extent, Google could create its own elite university for programmers and charge $100,000 a year, and they'd have lines out the door, right? And if you think about the margins on that, having 2,000 people at $100,000 a year will start even 10,000 people, and then there's sort of this massive ability to approach large ecosystem development, like charging for certifications. And I do think that people will pay, maybe not for the course so much because content is free, but they will pay for the certification. And so I think those are two directions that Google, for example, could go in.
And so if in 5 to 10 years or in the next decade, the crisis of employability is as you discuss it, if we made a real dent, we as in society made a real dent in solving for it, do you think the biggest leverage point is sort of a new generation of apprenticeship and staffing companies?
Yeah, it's new pathways to jobs. I like to say that you can imagine every large MSA in the country having 20 to 30 of these pathways that are hiring 1,000 a year into these programs that have no friction whatsoever, not asking you to take any financial risk, paying you from day one. It just levels the playing field so much in America. It's no longer a question of pedigree or degree or wealth or who you know or network. These pathways are going to screen based on cognitive skills, technical skills, soft skills that are correlated to performance in that role and persistence in that role. And we've seen levels of diversity that are 2 to 4 times the level in the industry coming into these pathways. Ultimately, we think a lot of the social and political turmoil we've seen over the last decade since the Great Recession is in large part a product of the fact that it seems like there are fewer pathways to opportunity for this generation than there were for prior generations. Certainly, a bachelor's degree and graduating from college and all that's involved in that is pretty much right now, the only pathway. Like unless you're Mark Zuckerberg, you sort of the dropout of the elite college. But for the most part, young people or older people who were displaced out of manufacturing economy or now due to COVID from retail or food service or travel or hospitality. What are the pathways available to them? We need to create new pathways, and to do that, you really need to think about the frictions for the individual and the frictions for the employer. So that's what we're doing, and we have a private sector solution for doing it. But just yesterday I was having a call with a big philanthropy, thinking about how can this be done on a nonprofit basis? How could the government build similar pathways? But that's what it needs to be. For decades, policymakers in America have struggled with the question of how to expand apprenticeships beyond building and construction trades. We've always, looked to, when are we going to see big apprenticeships in tech and in healthcare and financial services and so forth? And we've always waited for those large employers to launch these programs, but we're going to wait a long time for them because they just have other priorities. They're going to do what's in their own interest and not necessarily maybe even in their own long-term interest. But we do know who will build these apprenticeship programs, and that is businesses that can make a business out of providing purpose-trained talent at scale to their clients. And so that's where we're focused.
I think one of the most interesting things, Erik, is Silicon Valley tends to view the employment problem as let's get a tech solution on the table. Let's source people better. Someone pitched me once in the Avengers when he puts the thing on his head and he can figure out where all the mutants are in the world. What's the machine called? Go out and in the future, there'll be some way to reach out into the universe and find the smart people and bring them. And it actually really doesn't work that way. The people need whole solutions, right? If you're a recent college grad or leaving the military or displaced by COVID or something else, you need someone to actually sit down and talk to you and bring you to a maybe even a place and say, here is your pathway. Because let me ask you a question, and I know we're not supposed to ask the host a question, but what do you think the average biology major makes in the United States after graduating from college?
$80,000 a year? I'm guessing.
$30,000. Now think about this, right? This is a person who got to college, went through probably one of the hardest programs, right? Probably did some programming, stats, STEM, really a hard program. But what were they trained for? They were trained to go to medical school. And if they don't get a job in medical school, are they going to go work at a lab? And so we have this amazing, and they're never going to get that job at Google, right? I mean, unless they went to Harvard, right? Yeah. Google is not hiring bio majors from San Diego State University.
Right.
That is wasted human capital. And that person, we're not going to find that person through any of the existing recruiting channels. They're not on the grid for anything that you would use the Avengers Assemble device for. That person needs to be explained, hey, we're going to use a lot of technology to source you. We're going to use a lot of technology to get you through a program with online learning and competency-based instruction. And we're going to screen you for things like grit and capacity. And if you get through our screen, you're guaranteed a job at the end of it. And not only guaranteed a job making $50,000, $60,000, so more than you would, in your other alternatives, your $30,000 alternatives, but in 2 or 3 years, you'll be making $150,000. And the ability to do that at scale is probably the single most important thing from a social mobility perspective we can do as a country. And government hasn't been able to do that in the United States. Our systems are too fragmented. We don't have the European system of apprenticeships that grew up in sort of, Austria and Germany and Switzerland. We frequently hear, every week, at least pre-COVID, Ryan likes to say that, we had a different politician saying they've flown over to Germany for, Riesling and Wiener Schnitzel to learn all about apprenticeships. And they come home back to America and they realize that universities and business don't talk to each other, right? And so we're probably not going to have a government sector solution, unfortunately. So what is the private sector solution that connects and actually holds people's hands on both sides, right? The employer side and the consumer side, to walk them together. Because as Ryan said, no one wants a bunch of 20-somethings who don't know anything about their business running around their companies. JP Morgan does not want a 22-year-old recent college graduate, running around coding. I mean, it's just not going to happen. That's really what we're trying to solve for.
And you're taking more of the private equity route to do, I guess, because one path could be, hey, Lambda for X. Let's, seed a bunch of Lambda school competitors for different categories. Do you bristle at that? Or talk a little bit about...
No, that's fine. I mean, the problem with Lambda and all of these programs is that, it's what we call a train and pray model, right? You train and you got to pray they get jobs. And you can be as, Udacity launched these programs that were developed in conjunction with Google, right? I mean, you can have as close a connection in terms of the curriculum development, but you'll note that Google isn't hiring anyone from the Udacity program. At least they haven't announced they are. So, our point is, if you're seeking to be upskilled in a sector where there's a true talent gap, and someone is asking you to pay for that upskilling or take any financial risk at all, then they have either the wrong business model or a very unimaginative business model, because there is a willing payor for that upskilling. And that's the employer at the other end who can't find that talent. So it's about building that link, a true full stack solution from candidate to employer, and solutions that start from the standpoint of, I'm going to build a school, or I'm going to build an online school, are never going to build that bridge completely. There'll be a disappointed bridge, a pier, not a full bridge. You'll end up jumping off that pier into the ocean.
Yeah, I mean, we're fans of Austin. He's an amazing person, and so. But if you look at they just published their outcome report a couple of days ago, and they're at like 70-80% success rate, which is getting someone into a first job, right? And then how many of them? And I don't know if it's in the report this year, but then how many of them are there 2-3 years later, right? How many? And that's not a knock on what they're doing, because I actually think what they're doing is very important, and we will have Lambda for X, right? That will be a business model. But it's so much more powerful to say, not I'm Lambda for X, but I'm more like Accenture for X, right? Or I'm more like, I'm able to guarantee employment from day one. I'm a full stack solution to the employment problem. And that's not just what the consumer needs, because that 22-year-old biology major who doesn't know the first thing about healthcare IT, and the hospital that knows they need a healthcare IT person who's certified in Epic, that's a 2 to 3 year investment. It's not a 3-month investment. It's not, Lambda is by definition, it's hard. The longer that process goes, the harder it is. But to take someone from initial programmer or recent college grad or parting the military to actually certified and able to function on their own in a large, complex organization is generally more than a 3-month process.
Yeah. And so is one of the reasons that you're choosing to work with later stage companies because they've already built those bridges? They've done the hard part already, basically?
That was our Copernican revolution, right? When we kind of sat down and said, like, what have we figured out? And what was our biggest problem when we owned Coding Bootcamp? And still do to some extent. It was getting an MSA, or getting a master services agreement with a Fortune 500 company is a multi-year process. That doesn't work in venture world, right?
And you probably won't if you're a startup. I mean, why would they, right? So, the company we bought, Achieve's first investment, is a healthcare IT solutions business that has MSAs with over 200 hospital systems around the country. That's the distribution we're buying. And now they can push a new product, which is purpose-trained entry-level talent made available on a try before you buy basis to hospitals. And the hospitals are delighted. They love it.
So what I'm sort of gathering from this conversation is we're sort of talking about it as though, let's take the college education, the higher education system as given. What changes can we make, or what improvements can we make, given that higher ed is going to stay the way it is?
Yeah, as we like to say, no one has ever gone broke betting against the pace of change in higher education.
and so, just for maybe shits and giggles here, but if you could wave a wand and change anything about the higher ed structure such that it could address this specific problem, or the crisis of employability, and not just higher ed specifically, but maybe our culture around higher ed, or just how we think about higher ed as a country, what might that be?
Well, I'm sure we'll have different answers here. I'll give you a very specific one, which is turn degree programs upside down, which means in your first year, you're not taking big lecture classes in psychology and economics. You're actually earning a certificate that's going to be recognized in industry. And if you progress beyond that, great, take that gen ed. But recognize that almost half of all students who undertake degree programs don't complete. And the vast majority of them who don't complete are gone within or after that first year. So at least leave them with an industry recognized credential that can be of value to them. And that will also help mitigate this sort of college or bust or college or nothing culture that we have.
Yeah, I mean, you're not going to be surprised that Ryan and by the way, this is not, Harvard is not going to change, right? I mean, let's be clear about what we're talking about here. But to some extent, it probably should as well, which is, and I think it's a riff on what Ryan said, which is I'm a big believer in work colleges. And if you're not familiar with them, it's like Northeastern's co-op program, right? And there are a growing number of schools that have adopted this model. And I think that it used to be that people went to college to learn, and it was viewed as sort of like a stamp. Over the last 15, 20 years, the reason people go to college has changed. And now people go to college to get economic improvement. And that's why state governments fund it. That's why the federal government funds it. And I think the universities are behind in realizing that change has happened underneath their feet. And so I think schools need to really consider what the return on investment is. I just had the other piece to this is I think a lot of education should be free. And I had a piece in the Wall Street Journal last week or a few weeks ago, basically how the private sector should figure out a way to get higher education free. I think those two things of making sort of the didactic portion of education effectively free, coupled with work, you can retain what makes college special, but change some pieces of it that are really harming our society.
If I understand Brian Kaplan or Richard Vedder correctly, I think they would prefer that government just got out of the entire business of higher education, because I think they would say it sort of warps the incentives. Colleges don't have skin in the game. They're just making it more and more expensive because they can, and that there are other solutions, maybe ISAs, maybe crowdfunding, maybe other financial instruments that could be introduced to push down the price of college, separate from just pure competition. Introducing competition and make it easier for colleges to get accredited and become competitors. Does all of that resonate with you, or do you push back on any of that, or what comes to mind?
Yeah, that's not going to happen.
That government has a role to play, and where it has a role might be changing and might be different, but it is economic suicide to stop investing in higher education as a country. So I push back really strongly on that. I think what the delta between what you're describing and what I think Ryan and I are talking about is higher education is two things. One is civic education, right? It's learning, it's history, it's all that. I was a history major, Ryan as well, and job training, right? And those are two very different things, and they should not be conflated. And if I had to wave a magic wand and say, how would I allocate government money? It would be to make sure that everybody has an equal shot, right? Making sure that there's plenty of funding to make sure that people who come from disadvantaged backgrounds get enough education and training to have a shot to be able to pass a job-oriented test, right? It's at the front end of how you educate people. But I don't think government should be in the business of job training for the most part, because they're not the right people to decide what good jobs are and how to get them.
Yeah, I would say that if we had a utopian K-12 education system that was preparing 18-year-olds with sort of all of the sort of basic skills that they would need, plus some limited technical skills, then I might have more sympathy for the Vedder Kaplan position. But there's just so much inequality in this country, structural and otherwise, that we're much of what higher education is trying to do is to try to redress the inequality of our K-12 system. So that's going to require probably more investment, but we would like to see the investment focused in a very different way, whereas today the emphasis seems to be on a combination of increasing access and debt forgiveness. We would like to see the investment in outcomes and jobs. I mean, that's ultimately what it's about. If you're, we know what it looks like where we have universal access to post-secondary education and poor or no employment outcomes. That's called Europe. And anyone really wants to build that in America.
And so what would it look like to redirect that money to outcomes? Is it government works programs or jobs programs or something else?
I would love to see some fraction of the hundreds of billions of dollars that are spent on accredited colleges and universities actually paying for placement. So I could imagine very large intermediaries getting into the kind of businesses and pathways that we're building. If the government said, look, if you take a candidate who fits these criteria and you invest in them and you train them and you mentor them and you end up placing them at a client, here's $50,000. for you. Well, that's interesting. Maybe I should think about, building a new talent as a service business within my existing business. And that's where you get a pathway that's pushing through 10,000 new candidates a year who otherwise would not have had a pathway to those careers. So instead of just paying for education, why don't we pay for the outcome we're seeking, which is placement and career launch?
Yeah. You wrote a book a few years ago called Unbundling Education or Higher Education. How do we expect it to get further unbundled in the next few years to the next decade? Do we expect a lot of job training or higher education to go to the boot camps instead of university, or how do we foresee the unbundling happening?
Yeah, it's a great question. So when I wrote that book in 2015. It was sort of before the last mile training revolution, before we'd even coined the term last mile training. So I wasn't sure. It was a vague idea that college, as we know it, is a bundle of a whole bunch of different products and services. And we know that technology has a way of unbundling. It did in music, and it's doing it in TV and so forth. So are we going to see an unbundling of the degree? And there are others in the space who have written it's like, yes, technology itself is going to unbundle degrees because everything's going to be delivered online. And I think if COVID has shown us anything, it's that there aren't too many people who are interested in going to college online if there's another option. So I think the answer is not that technology is unbundling the degree itself. But what technology is doing is it's changing the world of work, digital transformation of employment, and it's changing the kinds of skills that employers are looking for so that it's going to transform higher education in a roundabout way by changing employer needs and employer preferences. And they are the ultimate consumers of what higher education is producing, right? They are the buyers of the talent that higher education is producing. And if their demands are just so far removed now from what higher education is producing, it's going to create a huge gap. And so that's where we're going to see the unbundling, which is, as you say, the emergence of these new last mile programs, boot camps, yes, income share programs, yes, but more likely and more scalable, these new sort of friction-free apprenticeship models. And if you can envisage a world where you have dozens of these in every large city in the country. And, I've got an 18-year-old who's contemplating whether or not to take on huge financial risk by attending a college. And again, if they get into, a top 10 or top 20 school, they'll probably go. But that's like, 2% of the population. So we're talking about the other 98%, between a friction-free, risk-free pathway to a good first job and taking on risk to attend sort of a lesser brand name institution with no financial guarantee. I think you're going to find some very talented, very motivated young people opting for the sort of risk-free pathway. And that's how you get unbundling, which is to say, when those 98% of schools are seeing an enrollment shortfall because students are prospective students are opting for alternatives, faster and cheaper alternatives to good jobs, then they're going to have to change. But they won't change until they're forced to. And so, this year we've seen an additional factor, which is COVID, and the fact that we have virtually all but a couple, maybe a dozen universities in the country continuing to charge full freight for what is mostly online learning, even where they've allowed students back to campus. Most of the learning is being done online, and that's going to accelerate the unbundling. It's very clear that the student experience is now can be separated from the education component, which can be separated from the credential. So I think it's going to go even faster now.
One example people like to use a lot in Silicon Valley as well is Y Combinator, and I've heard the argument of like, YC mimics the network, the credential as it relates for founders, but does it in for a different kind of business model, which is more advantageous for the student. And then also just way less time, 3 months instead of 4 years. But that the net education has already been unbundled in some sense with the internet. The network, you'll see a lot more Y Combinator like programs, but it's the credential that's the hardest to really compete with or displace in terms of offering a 18-year-old something that would carries.
Yeah, but that's so the credential as the way we think about it, us oldies, and we think about it in terms of macro credentials, which were sort of generically significant of capability, right? Today we have the ability to go a level deeper, to double click on that degree, if you will, and actually see skills. So no one's hiring a developer because of a degree; they're hiring them because they're actually seeing their code, right? So, and there are lots of other areas of the economy now where you can actually where skills are visible, whether in the form of work product or in the form of digital credentials. One of the University Ventures portfolio companies is a company called Credly, which delivers about 90% of the micro credentials that are issued in the tech space. So we see the sort of explosion of micro credentialing, and if you have ample micro credentialing, then the value of that macro credential is much less.
Yeah. We also talked in the beginning about briefly address the crisis of affordability. Can you talk about if we were to make some real dent in that over the next decade, what that could look like?
I think that the analogy I would draw is, and I wrote this piece that basically, heavily regulated industries, prices compress very quickly when things change. And I started my career as an investment banker at Goldman Sachs, and one of my first clients was Ameritrade. And Ameritrade was founded by a guy named Joe Ricketts in Omaha, Nebraska. Exactly the wrong or the not exactly the person you would not expect to be revolutionizing an industry, right? As far from Silicon Valley as you could find. But, he said, all right, fax me your brokerage orders and I'll complete them for $99. And then he said, do them on the internet and I'll do them for $10. And I remember sitting in the back, sitting in a car with him, kind of really confused by his business model. Because I was like, how are you going to make it work if you don't charge? He's like, I'm gonna make it free. And he kind of looked at me, he's like, if we don't make it free, someone else will. Right. And you think about what ended up happening was now they're selling order flow, and Robinhood makes all of its money from order flow, not from charging for the trade. And Google provides Gmail for free in return for making, the customer effectively the value, right? The customer information, the value. And I think something similar will happen in education where, the end product of education will be some version of filling a specific job need in society that someone is willing to pay for, whether it's the government or industry. And so, I think that everyone always talks about kind of the macro trend that higher education is just getting more expensive, and that is true. And what's happening though, and you're seeing more and more schools do this, is they realize they can't charge that much. We've kind of reached that somewhere. COVID, I think, is breaking the camel's back, the last straw that breaks the camel's back. And you've seen a number of universities publicly announce significant decreases in price. But I don't think they've quite conceptualized how big the bubble bursting can be. Once you go and you realize that you can get the same degree from Western governors for $10,000 that you're paying for a no-name middle school that no one's ever heard of in the middle of the country, why would I pay $50,000 for that when I can pay $10,000 for an online degree? There are a handful of these universities now that are basically purely online, nonprofit, pretty good quality, very good quality. Western Governors, Southern New Hampshire, Grand Canyon, they're American Public, where I'm on the board, that are driving down price very dramatically. And I think that's sort of the future. And I think that increasingly people will look at two different programs and say, one's 10,000, one's 50, I'm going to take 10,000. And then someone's going to come along and figure out how to say, the product is the student at the end of it, and I'm going to charge you nothing. And like, that's the sharp slope we're on.
And that's helpful context. Maybe for some historical overview, and maybe there's so many things, but if you were to look back at the last 50 years or further and assess sort of like what's the biggest things that happened that have led to us being in this mess that we are in? What were sort of the biggest catalysts or biggest turning points?
That's funny. I literally have a piece coming out tomorrow where I talk about this is all the baby boomers' fault. Blame the boomers, because really before them, there were, multiple pathways to opportunity in this country. And it's sort of the mass attendance at college turned that into the sole pathway to economic prosperity, or maybe to put it a better way, the sole respectable pathway. There's certainly a bit of snob appeal associated with that. That I think has been really deleterious. I think this is if you look at millennials and now Gen Z, they're much more than sort of snob appeal or the sort of self-discovery or self-realization that purportedly comes from a 4-year journey at an accredited college. They value much more highly security, guarantees of career, financial well-being, and purpose. So if we can provide clear, direct pathways to purposeful careers and jobs that don't require them to take inordinate financial risks, they're going to be much better off than today's students are.
In our last, few remaining minutes here, I'm curious for anything that we didn't cover that seems helpful for people to know or for that context. Another way of asking that question, Ryan, would be if you wrote your next book on higher education, what would this new take be?
I get asked that. I don't know. I think there's a scenario in which we do have sort of mass exodus from the current 4-year degree system, and I'm concerned as to what we might lose there. Right. I mean, there's certainly an element of discovery, general education that's not being delivered now in our K-12 system that either need to be replaced by a K-12 or perhaps supplemented afterwards, and sort of restaging how that occurs. But for now, I think we're just happy building and chronicling the building of these new pathways. There's a lot of work to do. So you're not going to see a new book from me for a while until we have, a mass of these new pathways up and running and succeeding.
I think Ryan's next book's actually going to be about the rebundling of higher education. And I think this
That's
happens
possible.
a lot, which is you go through these cycles where the unbundling of cable, actually now it's kind of rebundled to Netflix and sort of different packaging of the bundle. And I just want to echo Ryan. People think that we're opposed to higher education or funding of higher education. Like that's really not what we're about. Education, I mean, we're in this because we think education is actually critically important to our society. And I think that too often when people start talking about what's wrong with higher education and education in general, they forget what's right about it. And, our society, you say, look back 50 years, what are the oldest institutions we have as a society? Besides the Catholic Church today, I don't think we have an institution older than the university. And so I think, there's plenty to complain about. And there's plenty to say we can blame boomers all we want. But there is a reason why universities exist. And I don't think that's going to go away. In fact, I think some of the things, my call to your kind of viewership or readership or whatever we call podcastership is, the robber barons of the late 19th century created the modern university. They created the research university. They created Stanford. Leland Stanford was a robber baron. Carnegie Mellon was 2 robber barons put together. MIT was funded by robber barons. Johns Hopkins University, right? And they revolutionized the university. And I think what I'm most disappointed with Silicon Valley about is that they haven't made the donations, the sort of the founding of sort of what the next thing is in how people transmit knowledge to the next generation. And I don't want to lose that. And I fear that with, even with some of what we do, we don't want to be part of losing that as a society.
Who is the rebundler? And what could that look like?
You asked what is next book. I tried to throw out his next book, and now you're asking what the next book's really about. Chapter, geez,
you're not going to get a book published unless you know what it's about. I'll tell you that.
Well, if
it's a great question. Look, I think there are going to be lots of the level of entrepreneurship and innovation. I joked before about the pace of change in higher education, or half joked. There are going to be thousands of dynamic, experienced higher education managers and entrepreneurs running around trying to figure that out. And the challenge is that you're dealing with a highly regulated industry. So it's not as simple as just saying you're a university and opening the door. But we're confident that there will be new models and solutions, and probably models and solutions that actually have public sanction and approval for, and probably new funding models as well. So it's not going to happen overnight, but it will happen. But it's not going to happen because they want to do it. It's going to happen because students will be voting with their feet in favor of faster and cheaper models, and these universities will have no choice but to look for alternative models.
Awesome. That's a great place to wrap. My guests today have been Ryan Craig and Daniel Pianko of Achieve Partners. Ryan, Daniel, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
That was fun. Thanks, Erik.
Pleasure. Thanks.
And Ryan's books are Unbundling the University and A New You. They're both great reads. I highly recommend reading them. And of course, stay tuned for his future book. If you're an early stage entrepreneur, we'd love to hear from you. Check us out at villageglobal.vc.